All right, welcome back to the Roommate Humanities vlog. This is part 2 in my ongoing series of fantasy glossary terms. Okay, so we're picking up where we left off last time with the letter B. So the first item on my list is Bard. Now, Bard is two things in fantasy. First of all, it is a prominent character from The Hobbit. Second of all, it is a sort of a traveling storyteller minstrel figure, often who shows up in taverns in order to help our protagonist along with their adventure. They tend to be very good travelers, and they're good traveling companions. Next up, we have bears, as in the three talking bears, I assume. I have a longer spiel that I go on about talking animals that I'm not going to here, but feel free to approach me in public and ask me what I think about talking animals and the Hunger Games. I hope that got you curious. I think there are three kinds of talking animals in fantasy. First of all, you have the talking animals that wear pants and live in houses and eat food and do agriculture and sometimes have weapons and fight. You see a lot of these in stories like Wind in the Willows or Miss Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. You see characters like this in C.S. Lewis's Narnia series. You see characters like this in The Wizard of Oz. They're all over the place. I think that they are sort of a trope of younger fantasy that's meant for kids, but they can be a lot of fun too. The second type is animals who only talk to one person, like in Coraline, where there's the cat that sort of communicates only with Coraline, or like a spirit animal, or something that takes the form of an animal on Earth in order to communicate with one character. And I feel like that's different from an animal that like is otherwise a baker or a barber or something. Things that begin with B. And the final type of talking animal in a story is a human being who's been transformed into an animal. Like you see this with like the Frog Prince, and you see this in Beauty and the Beast, and you see this in other stories like Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare, where Nick Bottom has been transformed into a donkey, and he keeps talking like a person, but they start to affect the actions and the wants and motivations of an animal. It's a lot of fun. The next item on my list is Berserker. Now, Berserker is sort of a real history Viking Norse type thing. In fantasy, they tend to be warriors. They don't tend to wear a lot of clothing. They have a lot of tattoos and facial hair. They carry really, really big weapons and like weapons as big as they are. And they're a lot of fun. They go into a fury and they don't feel pain and they become very dangerous. The next item on my list is Balloon. I really like improbable transportation, things you wouldn't expect to be able to get from point A to point B, but through the powers of magic, they can be powered mystically. So you get a lot of balloons, and you get carriages that don't need driving. Some stories have couches that are made to fly. It's a really good time. And that's it for B. Next up we have C, and I only have one item. It's Chimera, and I'm pretty sure that's a pronunciation. Chimera. It's Greek. It is a combination of animals into a single monster. The word in English sort of means like an impossible image. So you could use it to describe something that was unattainable or undoable on Earth. You know, like a chimeric pursuit, or it's a good word. And you can use them a lot in fantasy to make monsters out of ordinary things. And that brings us to D. The first item on my list is Death. I love Terry Pratchett, and Death is a character in his stories. And Death is often a character in fantasy, either good or bad, or something else entirely. People tend to go with the Grim Reaper motif, although I've seen the Rider of the Apocalypse Death as well. Finally, sometimes in fantasy, death, like the state, living dead, cannot always be permanent. Like sometimes people can die and come back. Sometimes death is a place that people go, and they can visit from it. You have a lot of options in fantasy. Death is very, very cool. And the final item on my D list, and I think that's going to be it for today, is Dragon. Now, Dragon is old. I've heard people call it Greek. I've heard people call it Norse. There are, of course, the Eastern dragons that are really, really cool and different. They tend to be a combination, again, of animals, like a chimera, with real emphasis on the lizard, snake, wings, and teeth and claws and whatnot. I will say this, though. My favorite dragons are the medieval dragons, medieval Europe dragons, because they tend to be really little. Like you see these illustrations where like St. George is battling a dragon that's like a little bit smaller than his horse. And at some point or other, the dragons start getting really, really big, but until then, they tend to be little, but still very deadly. Definitely associated with evil. You eventually start to get dragons that are associated with good much, much later on, but I think that's a general trend of fantasy villains in general. They start off evil, but the longer you tell stories about them, the more good they become. Vampires being a great example. Hopefully that won't happen to zombies. Anyhow, that's all I got for D. Thank you for joining me.